Whoopi Goldberg came prepared to dismantle Karoline Leavitt's arguments, until Karoline flipped the script and left Whoopi struggling for a comeback on live TV. The moment the cameras went live, there was already a certain energy in the room, the kind you could feel through the screen. The audience at The View was buzzing, waiting for what they knew would be a heated discussion. This wasn't just any guest appearance. This was Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative voice, someone who never shied away from pushing back. And she was sitting across from Whoopi Goldberg, a woman who had built her career on sharp wit, strong opinions, and an unapologetic attitude. Whoopi leaned forward, eyes locked on Karoline. "Let me just say this right now," she started, her voice firm and controlled. "The problem with this push against wokeness," she made air quotes with her fingers, "is that without it, women wouldn't be where they are today. Civil rights wouldn't have advanced. A lot of the freedoms people take for granted today would have never happened." The audience clapped, some even cheered. Whoopi sat back, letting the moment settle. Karoline didn't flinch. She let the applause fade before speaking. "Whoopi, I respect your passion," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. "But the problem isn't people wanting equality. The problem is that wokeness has been twisted into something that punishes those who think differently. People are losing jobs, getting silenced, being treated like criminals for having conservative values." A low murmur ran through the audience. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying accountability is a problem?" she shot back. Karoline shook her head. "I'm saying there's a difference between accountability and mob rule. Look at the economy, look at the state of the country. People are struggling more now than they did a few years ago. But instead of talking about real issues, the conversation always circles back to identity politics." Whoopi folded her arms. "And why do you think that is?" Karoline took a breath, sitting up straighter. "Because it's a distraction. It's easier to argue about pronouns than to talk about inflation. It's easier to divide people than to fix actual problems. And the worst part? The people pushing this so-called progress are the same ones sitting in million-dollar homes, sending their kids to private schools, while everyday Americans, working-class Americans, are left dealing with the consequences." That struck a nerve. Some audience members nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi chuckled, shaking her head. "You know, that's the thing about people in politics. You talk a big game about the people, but at the end of the day, the folks at the top, your party included, don't actually care about the little guy either." Karoline smirked. "You mean like how Hollywood celebrities talk about oppression while flying in private jets?" The room reacted. Some gasped, some laughed. The energy shifted. Whoopi waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, come on. That's the oldest talking point in the book." Karoline shrugged. "Doesn't mean it's not true." The tension was thick, the conversation teetering between debate and something much more explosive. But both women knew the game: push too far too soon, and you lose the audience. There was an art to this, a rhythm. And this was just the beginning. But things were about to take a turn, and the gloves were coming off. Whoopi adjusted her glasses and leaned back, arms crossed. "All right, Karoline. Let's talk about this. You say wokeness is a distraction, but let's be real, if people hadn't fought for change, women like you wouldn't even be sitting here today." The audience clapped again. A few people cheered. Karoline gave a small smile, unfazed. "And I appreciate those fights. But Whoopi, here's the thing, fighting for rights isn't the same as forcing a political agenda down people's throats. There's a difference between pushing for fairness and pushing for total control over what people can say, think, and believe." Whoopi scoffed. "So now being socially aware is control? That's the problem with conservatives. You all think accountability is oppression." Karoline tilted her head slightly, keeping her voice even. "No, accountability is one thing. But let's talk about reality. If someone on the left says something controversial, they get a pass. If a conservative does, they are fired, banned, and labeled a bigot. Look at how people who questioned COVID policies were treated. Look at how parents who protested at school board meetings were called domestic terrorists. Is that fairness? Or is that silencing people who don't agree with the narrative? The crowd stirred. Some murmured in agreement, others looked uncomfortable. Whoopi shook her head. Oh, come on. That's an exaggeration. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Is it? Because just last year, a teacher in California was fired for refusing to use preferred pronouns. A father in Virginia was arrested for speaking out at a school board meeting after his daughter was assaulted in a bathroom by a student who claimed to be transgender. And let's not forget about journalists being censored for questioning the origins of COVID. But sure, Whoopi, tell me again how cancel culture isn't real. That landed even Joy Behar, who had been silent so far, shifting in her seat. She exhaled, rolling her eyes. You know, I find it funny how conservatives love to play the victim, Whoopi said. Karoline leaned forward slightly. And I find it funny how liberals claim to be tolerant, until someone disagrees with them. The audience reacted, some laughing, some booing. Whoopi narrowed her eyes. You act like the right is innocent in all this. Your party wants to ban books, control women's bodies, and tell people how to live their lives. But you want to cry about being silenced? Karoline didn't miss a beat. And the left wants to indoctrinate kids, erase biological reality, and force compliance through social pressure and censorship. Tell me, Whoopi, if this is all about freedom and progress, why do people get fired for stating basic facts? Why are comedians apologizing for jokes? Why is it suddenly controversial to say men and women are different? Whoopi opened her mouth, then hesitated for a split second. Karoline caught it. See that pause right there? That's because even you know there's a line, and your side keeps moving it. The audience reaction was mixed, some clapped, others groaned. Whoopi shook her head, trying to reset. Karoline, here's the thing. Every generation pushes boundaries. The things that were controversial 30 years ago are normal now. That's progress. Karoline nodded. Sure. But at what point does progress become a weapon? At what point does forcing people to accept an ideology cross the line into authoritarianism? Whoopi sighed, rubbing her forehead. Oh, Lord. Karoline leaned back, crossing her arms. What? Too real? Whoopi forced a smile. No. Just predictable. Karoline shrugged. Predictable or uncomfortable? Whoopi stared at her for a moment, then turned to the audience. You see what they do? They come on these shows, talk real smooth, act all reasonable, but what they really want is to turn back the clock. And we're not going back. The audience erupted into cheers. Whoopi let them have their moment. Karoline smiled again, waiting. Then, as the noise settled, she spoke. Nobody's trying to go backward, Whoopi. But maybe some of us don't think progress means erasing common sense. The air was thick with tension. Even the other hosts seemed unsure of what to say next. But this was only the beginning, things were about to get personal. Whoopi let out a short laugh, shaking her head. You know, I've been doing this a long time, Karoline. I've seen people come and go, spouting the same nonsense about how common sense is under attack. But here's what I don't get, why is it always conservatives who feel so oppressed when the world changes? Karoline rested her hands on the table. Because, Whoopi, it's not about change. It's about how that change is being forced. People are being told they have to accept things that go against reality, or else. You can lose your job, your reputation, your ability to speak freely, all because you refuse to go along with an ideology. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. You keep using that word, forced. No one is forcing anything on anyone. Karoline leaned in slightly. Oh, really? Then why are parents being labeled bigots for wanting a say in what their kids are taught? Why are people afraid to state biological facts? Why did a man in New York lose his job just for saying he didn't want to put pronouns in his email signature? Whoopi waved her hand. Oh, please. Conservatives love playing the victim. You want to talk about being silenced? Try being black in America. Try being a woman in a man's world. Try actually living with the consequences of the policies your side pushes. Karoline didn't even blink. You want to talk about consequences, Whoopi? Okay, let's talk about crime. Let's talk about inflation. Let's talk about the fact that people can barely afford groceries right now, but the media would rather push identity politics instead of holding this administration accountable for what's happening to working-class Americans. Whoopi sat forward. So now you care about working-class Americans? Karoline nodded. Yes. Do you? The audience reacted, some gasped, others murmured. Whoopi exhaled through her nose, staring at Karoline like she was trying to figure out how to respond without giving her opponent more ammunition. See, this is what conservatives do. You take real issues, real problems, and you twist them into an excuse to push your agenda. You want to talk about crime? Okay, what about the January 6th rioters? What about the people who stormed the Capitol and threatened democracy? Karoline tilted her head. What about the people who burned down cities during the summer of 2020? What about the businesses destroyed? The lives ruined? Funny how one group gets called insurrectionists, and the other gets called peaceful protesters. The tension in the room was thick. Even the other host sat in silence, watching the exchange unfold. Whoopi clenched her jaw. You seriously can't see the difference? Karoline met her gaze. I see the double standard. For the first time, Whoopi didn't have an immediate response. She pressed her lips together, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Karoline took the opening. Let's be honest, Whoopi. If a conservative celebrity said half the things you've said about Republicans, they'd be blacklisted overnight. If someone on the right questioned the COVID narrative the way the left now admits they were wrong about, they'd be permanently banned from social media. But it's okay when your side does it, right? Whoopi forced a smile. You really think conservatives have it so hard, don't you? Karoline shrugged. I think there's a reason people are afraid to speak up, and that reason isn't progress, it's control. Whoopi leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. You know what I think? I think people like you push this whole victim narrative because, deep down, you know the world is changing and you can't stop it. Karoline didn't break eye contact. And I think people like you push wokeness because, deep down, you know it's built on hypocrisy. The silence stretched. The audience was no longer just reacting, they were holding their breath. But the real bombshell hadn't even dropped yet. That was coming next. Whoopi exhaled sharply, shifting in her seat. You know, Karoline, for someone who talks a lot about hypocrisy, you sure don't seem to have a problem with the hypocrisy on your own side. Karoline leaned back slightly, giving Whoopi space to continue. She knew how this worked. Sometimes, the best move was to let the other person dig their own hole. Whoopi sat up straighter, steadying herself. You want to talk about free speech? About how conservatives are being silenced? Fine. Let's talk about how your side censors real history. Let's talk about banning books, about rewriting school curriculums to hide the ugly parts of America's past. Let's talk about how Republican-led states are making it harder for people to vote while claiming to care about democracy. The audience clapped, and Whoopi took a second to let it sink in before adding, so please, spare me the speech about control. Your party's been trying to control what people learn, how they live, and even what they do with their own bodies for decades. Karoline nodded as if she expected that response. Okay, let's break that down. You say conservatives are banning books. What books? The ones with explicit material being pushed on middle schoolers? Because last I checked, parents actually have a right to decide what's appropriate for their kids. That's not censorship. That's called parenting. Whoopi rolled her eyes. Right. Parenting. That's the excuse. Karoline shrugged. You say we're rewriting history, but what's actually happening is that schools are being forced to teach kids that America is an irredeemably racist country, that they should be ashamed of where they come from. Is that education or indoctrination? The room felt different now. The crowd wasn't as loud. Some people clapped, but others hesitated. Whoopi narrowed her eyes. You know damn well that's not what's happening. Karoline smiled slightly. Then why are kids being taught that meritocracy is racist? Why are advanced math programs being removed in the name of equity? Why are we lowering academic standards instead of raising students up? Whoopi's lips pressed together. She wasn't used to guests firing back this aggressively. Karoline saw the hesitation and pushed forward. You say conservatives are making it harder for people to vote. But let's be honest, showing an ID to vote is common sense. You need an ID to buy alcohol, to board a plane, to get government benefits. But suddenly, asking for an ID to vote is oppression? Whoopi's voice sharpened. You know damn well that voter ID laws disproportionately affect black and low-income communities. Karoline raised an eyebrow. So let me get this straight. You think black Americans can figure out how to get a driver's license, buy a house, open a bank account, but somehow, they can't get an ID to vote? Do you realize how insulting that sounds? The audience reaction was mixed. Some clapped, others booed. Whoopi let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. You are something else. Karoline didn't flinch. I'm just pointing out the facts, Whoopi. You don't have to like them. Whoopi leaned in, her voice lower. No. What you're doing is pushing the same tired talking points that keep this country divided. And that's exactly what your side wants, keep people scared, keep people angry, keep them blaming each other while the folks at the top get richer. Karoline met her gaze evenly. Oh, so now you're against division? Because last time I checked, your side profits off outrage just as much as anyone else. The difference is you pretend it's for progress. Whoopi stared at her, jaw tight. Then Karoline delivered the final hit. Tell me, Whoopi, how many of your Hollywood friends who talk about wealth inequality have given up their mansions? How many of them live paycheck to paycheck like the people they claim to fight for? Silence. Whoopi opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't used to being put on the spot like this. And just like that, the balance had shifted. But Karoline wasn't done yet. The next blow was going to hit even harder. For the first time, Whoopi didn't fire back immediately. The audience noticed. The other hosts noticed. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for the tension to thicken, before Whoopi scoffed and shook her head. You know what? She said, her voice slower, measured. You come on this show talking real smooth, acting like you've got all the answers. But let's be real, Karoline. You don't know what it's like to be a black woman in America. You don't know what it's like to fight for a voice in a country that never wanted to hear you. Karoline didn't flinch. And you don't know what it's like to be a conservative in America right now, to have your livelihood, your reputation, and your platform threatened for speaking the truth. Whoopi let out a sharp laugh. Oh, please. What truth are you even talking about? Karoline didn't hesitate. The truth that people are tired of the double standards. The truth that the same celebrities lecturing working-class Americans about climate change are flying in private jets. The truth that the media picks and chooses who to destroy based on their politics. The truth that your side claims to fight for oppressed people while living in multi-million-dollar mansions. The audience stirred. Whoopi shifted in her seat. The camera panned briefly to the other hosts, who looked uncomfortable. Karoline pressed forward. You sit here and talk about oppression, but Whoopi, be honest, are you oppressed? Whoopi's mouth opened, but Karoline wasn't done. You've built an incredible career. You're worth millions. You have influence, power, a platform most people could only dream of. So tell me, how exactly are you being silenced? Who's stopping you from speaking your mind? Whoopi's lips parted, but nothing came out. The weight of the question sat between them. Karoline tilted her head. See, that's the thing. The people crying the loudest about oppression are the ones who have the most power. Meanwhile, the single mom working 2 jobs, the small business owner struggling to keep their doors open, the father worried about his kids being taught radical gender ideology in school, those are the people who actually feel powerless. But they don't have a seat at this table, do they? A murmur ran through the audience. Some clapped. Others sat stiff and silent. Whoopi exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You really think you're standing up for the little guy, don't you? Karoline leaned back slightly, keeping her tone steady. I think someone has to. Whoopi folded her arms. And let me guess, you think Trump is that person? Karoline didn't miss a beat. I think the media tried to destroy him because he wasn't afraid to call out the system. Just like you trying to do to me right now. The air in the studio was thick. Whoopi blinked a few times, gripping her coffee cup a little tighter. Karoline smirked. You okay, Whoopi? You seem a little quiet all of a sudden. Whoopi exhaled, shaking her head again. You know what? You can sit here and say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, people are gonna see this for what it is, more right-wing fear-mongering. Karoline smiled. And people are gonna see that when you were finally challenged, you had nothing left but insults. Whoopi's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. The silence stretched. The audience didn't know whether to clap, boo, or just sit there and process what had just happened. But the fallout from this exchange was going to reach far beyond the walls of the studio. The moment the show cut to commercial, the studio erupted into murmurs. The other hosts exchanged glances, unsure whether to jump in or let Whoopi handle the situation. The tension in the room was undeniable. Something had shifted. Karoline stood up, adjusting her blazer, unfazed. She knew what was coming, the headlines, the backlash, the attempts to paint her as the villain. It was all predictable. Whoopi, still seated, exhaled heavily before turning to the producers off-camera. I need a break, she muttered, rubbing her temples. The production crew moved quickly, clearing the stage. But the damage was already done. Clips of the exchange were already making their way onto social media. Within minutes, Twitter was flooded with reactions. Karoline Leavitt just schooled Whoopi Goldberg on live TV. That was brutal. Whoopi had no argument, just deflection. The left can't handle facts. Leavitt represents everything wrong with America. How does someone like that? Karoline Leavitt got invited onto national television. The reactions were immediate, polarized, and relentless. Some celebrated her takedown of Whoopi Goldberg, while others called for her to be banned from ever appearing on the show again. CNN picked up the story that afternoon. The headline read, The View erupts into chaos after heated exchange between Whoopi Goldberg and Trump press secretary. MSNBC took a different angle, Karoline Leavitt's dangerous rhetoric, a new low for political discourse. Meanwhile, Fox News had a field day with Karoline Leavitt exposes Hollywood hypocrisy in intense exchange with Whoopi Goldberg. Everyone was talking about it. The media machine went into overdrive, dissecting every second of the confrontation. Political analysts weighed in. Think pieces flooded news sites. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist throwing in their 2 cents. But what no one could deny, regardless of which side they were on, was that Karoline had held her ground. That night, Karoline sat in her hotel room, scrolling through her phone. The texts, the emails, the calls, they wouldn't stop. Some congratulated her, others threatened her, but they all confirmed one thing, as she had made an impact. A message popped up from a number she didn't recognize. Respect. That took guts. She smirked and put her phone down. On the other side of the country, Whoopi Goldberg was having a very different evening. She sat alone in her dressing room, staring at her reflection. The View had been through controversy before, but something about this one stuck with her. She had been challenged, really challenged, and she hadn't been ready for it. A producer knocked softly on the door. "Whoopi, you okay?" She let out a slow breath. "Yeah, just thinking." The producer hesitated. "They want you to address it tomorrow. The network's already getting heat." Whoopi nodded. "I know." She knew how this worked. She would go back on air, double down, frame the conversation the way it needed to be framed. Damage control, that's how the game was played. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she had actually won. Social media continued to buzz. The left claimed Karoline was peddling extremism. The right claimed Whoopi had been exposed as a hypocrite. But beyond all the noise, one thing was clear: this wasn't just another TV debate. It was a turning point in the larger cultural war playing out in America. And whether people liked it or not, the conversation wasn't going away anytime soon. The sun rose on another day of outrage, debates, and endless takes. Every morning show, every political panel, every social media feed had one thing in common: the View debacle. Karoline Leavitt's name was everywhere. She was invited onto conservative talk shows, praised for standing her ground, hailed as a rising voice in the culture war. But she also faced an avalanche of backlash. Liberal commentators accused her of gaslighting, of manipulating the conversation to push a right-wing agenda. Celebrities chimed in, posting vague, disapproving messages about dangerous rhetoric. Even the White House press team was asked to comment. Meanwhile, Whoopi Goldberg returned to The View the next morning, visibly composed but still simmering. "I just want to say this," she began, looking straight into the camera. "Yesterday's conversation was a reminder that we are living in a time where people believe they can twist reality to fit their version of the truth. And I won't stand for that." The audience erupted in applause. But there was something different in Whoopi's demeanor. She wasn't as triumphant as usual. Because she knew that no amount of applause could erase what had happened the day before. The damage was done. Karoline, sitting in a new studio across the country, watched the clip on her phone. She smirked, tossing the device onto the table in front of her. She had seen this playbook before: reframe the conversation, shift the narrative, make yourself the righteous victim. But the difference this time? People had seen what happened. They had heard the exchange. And no amount of spin could erase the fact that she had stood her ground against one of the most powerful voices in mainstream media. A producer peeked into the room. "You on in 5. Karoline nodded, adjusting her microphone. She knew this was only the beginning. The real fight wasn't in the debate itself, it was in what came next. Meanwhile, in homes across America, people watched the debate play out on their screens. Some cheered for Karoline. Some raged against her. But many ordinary, working-class Americans, the ones who didn't spend their lives obsessing over politics, sat back and thought about what was said. They thought about how truth had become subjective. How disagreement had turned into something dangerous. How, somewhere along the way, real conversations had been replaced with tribal warfare. And whether they agreed with Karoline or not, many couldn't shake one simple realization. We are no longer allowed to question things without consequences. This wasn't just about The View. It wasn't just about Whoopi Goldberg or Karoline Leavitt. It was about something much bigger, the battle for the truth. The war over who gets to speak and who is forced to stay silent. And in that war, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. If you challenge the wrong people, you don't just risk losing an argument. You risk losing everything. So, what do you think? Was this just another TV spat? Or a glimpse into something much deeper? Let's talk about it. Hit that subscribe button and join the conversation.